Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hello, one and all, and welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. You are currently hearing the voice of your humble correspondent, Evan Buck. And with me today are two distinguished fellow amateur historians, two distinguished gentlemen. First off, we have Dylan Holzmer,
Hello, everybody.
and we have someone who has a particular catchphrase that he always likes to say to start off the episode. Chris Capola, what do you have to say to our audience?
Hi, good people.
All right. And now that it is officially an episode, also, I almost forgot I need to say my own catchphrase. Hello, everyone. How's it going? It's your boy, Evan. All right. Now that we've all got our introductions out of the way, let's jump right into the subject material that we're going to be looking at. We're going to be going in the Wayback Machine, not too far in the too distant past in modern history, more in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s timeframe. We are going to be going, however, to an area of the world that us three Western Americans don't necessarily go into all that often here on the show, and that is in China. We are going to be going and looking at a particular point in time in China with some key different players and individuals, but the main focus of the episode is going to be on really two main individuals. The first one is a man by the name of Zhao Ziyang, and he was the third premier of China from 1980 to 1987. And then backing him up as somewhat of an ally, somewhat of a contender at points, is also another important individual that some people might actually know a lot more about, and that is a man by the name of Deng Xiaoping. And there's a reason why you probably haven't heard of Zhao very much, and that's because the modern Chinese Communist Party apparatus probably would rather you forget about him. And so in today's fork, we're going to be looking at a particular point in time that, coincidentally, the Chinese Communist Party would also like to have you forget about, and that is with the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. That is not necessarily where the fork is going to happen, but it is the main area that we're probably going to be touching off from. And so, Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you to kind of help set up the background of the fork, and we'll take things from there.
So we talked about this a little bit off podcast. I have to thank a former boss of mine who was actually Taiwanese at one point for calling me very cultured for an American, which I actually took as a compliment. She meant it as. When the three of us were sitting around before, it was kind of a race to say we knew nothing about this. So we kind of decided, for the purpose of this podcast, we should go a little bit further back than we normally do. So everybody's familiar, Chinese Civil War, the communists win. Mao is in charge at that point. Korean War happens. We fight against them. Then Mao tries something called the Great Leap Forward, where they're going to collect literally like pots and pans from people, melt them down, and turn them into like industrial steel. Don't try that at home. It doesn't work. It's a horrible idea. And like there was that, they basically are they feel if you try hard enough, you can change anything you want. And it fails miserably. So actually within the Chinese Communist Party, around 1960, 1962, Mao was removed from power. He literally has no official role. Do you want to come in for a sec?
Yeah, I was just going to say something else that's also important to throw in here is that during this point in time, we see a rather widening rift between the Soviets and the Chinese, the Sino-Soviet split,
Mhm.
in the early 60s. And this is kind of important just to keep in the back of our minds as we move forward, because that I think is going to play a role in terms of what happens with our fork in time. So, but basically keep in mind, just because, you might identify it as communist or red doesn't mean you're necessarily on the same team or have the same approach. The Soviets and the Chinese very quickly become regional, I wouldn't necessarily say adversaries, but they definitely are not on the same page.
You're absolutely right, Dylan. Sorry, Evan. Um, and yeah, I will never admit to Dylan being right.
Oh,
Um,
who?
but in 1956, Khrushchev gives what is called the secret speech, where he comes out and talks about all the horrible things that Stalin did. And the Chinese communists look at that and say, wait a minute, you don't turn on your own almost. You don't air this kind of dirty laundry. And that did lead to a large split between Russia and China. Going forward, Mao was removed from power in the early 60s. And he basically starts the Cultural Revolution in 66 to get young Red Guards to put him back in power, to make a comeback. It's kind of interesting to think about the parallel political arcs of Richard Nixon and Mao, that both of them in the early 60s are in a complete political wilderness, and around 1968 find a way to come back to power in their respective countries. Richard Nixon opens up China by negotiating directly with Mao. It's very important. This is one of the things that Kissinger and Nixon did, is they realized Russia and China don't like each other. We can play them off against each other. In
And
19
Mao also did the Cultural Revolution as well. Don't
Yep.
forget about that in the late 1960s. So if you
Yep.
if you didn't think he didn't mess up the economy bad enough with the Great Leap Forward, he decided to try basically doing the same thing but on the cultural level,
Mhm.
and that didn't work out super great either.
Yep. So while Mao was out of power, Zhou Enlai, who was the premier of China, and Deng Xiaoping, who is young but coming into political importance, start economic experimentation. They start experimenting with economic zones where they allow basically free enterprise. Um, Mao, when he does come back during the Cultural Revolution, literally exiles Deng Xiaoping to a tractor factory where he is a lathe operator for 4 years. He's just a regular factory worker, waiting, and eventually Mao does bring him back. And Mao dies in 1976. Deng Xiaoping politically maneuvers with economic reformers and against what is called the Gang of Four, who, including one of them is Mao's wife, who are kind of at this point, they're the tradition. I balk at saying traditional conservative communist forces, but they're the traditional conservative communist forces in that
Heavy air quotes.
yeah, in that they want to be like an orthodox communist government versus Deng Xiaoping, who is a lot more open to economic reform. And we can't call it capitalism. We can't call it a free market, but that's what
but
it is.
it's less central planning at the very least.
It is absolutely.
Yeah, it's no more of the Mao styled central planning. Keep in mind the time frame on this is really interesting. Nixon opens up China in 72. Deng Xiaoping reappears from the tractor factory in 73. So a lot of these things that we're talking about are happening, over a broad period of time, but then some of the most important changes happen in quick succession.
So Deng Xiaoping basically solidifies his position as the primary Chinese leader. And it's always very opaque as to whether the leader is the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party or the premier or the president or there's a lot of, the opacity is on purpose because one of the things Deng kind of brings in is the rightist that he winds up outmaneuvering are not removed from power. More so, they're removed from power, but not their positions. They're still on the Central Committee. They're still in the Politburo. So in the early 80s, Deng Xiaoping keeps up with the economic reforms. He set out 4 kind of pillars that the party is still the primary political entity. We will not give up. We say we will never give up Marxism, Leninism, even though we're doing it, and other things like that. And Zhang, who is kind of the other primary person in this story, emerges as one of Deng Xiaoping's allies and becomes premier in the early 80s and helps carry out some of Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms. Is that fair, Evan?
Yeah, I would say that's a pretty fair characterization of who Zhao is and the role that he played. It is interesting to see, and kind of the main reason why we wanted to take this fork for a spin is because Zhao was kind of more of a, liberal reformer, but still well within the boundaries of, the Politburo, the Communist Party, these sorts of things. In our timeline, which I'll probably just start kind of explaining leading up directly to the fork here. In the late 80s, we had, I'm sure many of us, even in the West are very familiar with, we have the Tiananmen Square protests. And part of why that was happening is because Zhao basically wanted to pursue the Soviets had, with Gorbachev around this same time frame, they are pursuing 2 different policies, 2 different areas at the same time. You have perestroika, which is pursuing economic reforms of a very, archaic, centrally planned system for the economy. And then you have glasnost, which is more political openness, political reforms, political transparency. So Gorbachev is trying to pursue both of these at once. And Zhao was, kind of somewhat in that similar vein of thought. He was like, you know what? There's some things that aren't working here, and we should try pursuing both. And that led him to fighting a lot with, the old guard, the more what we would call conservative forces, but really they are the actual more dyed-in-the-wool, hardcore, Communist Party supporters. So when these protests start happening, Zhao was initially not wanting to respond with the show of force. That ended up actually happening. He wanted to, let it go forward and, leverage that really to try and push for more reforms. That is not ultimately what ended up happening. We have the famous pictures of, the man standing in front of the tanks and everything. And, a lot of bad things happened to those students. So this is where we get to our fork in time. With Zhao, who basically wanted to, support the right of the protesters and, hear them out, listen to them out. Maybe he was not as, liberally radical, reformed as those student protesters might have been, but he didn't want to pound them into the pavement with tanks. Eventually what ended up happening is in our timeline, the Deng Xiaoping, who was sort of like the kingmaker in this. He was kind of the linchpin. He was backing Zhao all up until this point. There came a certain point where Deng basically was like, you know what, this isn't going to work. This is untenable. He withdraws his support from Zhao. Zhao loses his post, loses the premiership, and is essentially, for all intents and purposes, expunged from party records. When he died in 2005, I remember reading up on an article on this when I was preparing for the episode. you could not get to his funeral, I believe, or like the memorial. I forget what it was, but it was something like that. Like without going, you had to go between like these really narrow streets, and you had, the secret police and the not so secret police like all over the place, basically willing to they if they thought that you were too suspicious, or they could pull you aside and question you at any point. And so not many people attended. Um, not, a very big deal. And to this day, China has not yet done a reviving or a revitalization as they have with some of their previously disgraced um, party members that have been kicked out of power.
Like I said, one of the things that Deng Xiaoping did after Mao, he kept people around. Even after you lost favor, you kept your position because you were still part of the political world. Zhang was so tied to Tiananmen Square. You could not understand Zhang without understanding Tiananmen. And we're not going to discuss Tiananmen at all. So all of the, like, from 89, 90, straight through up until basically the rise of Xi Jinping, if you lost power, nobody called on you in a Politburo meeting, but you were still a very powerful person. You were still like very safe. And one of the changes that Xi Jinping brought in is, all of a sudden his political rivals are being charged with corruption. That was a big change. Up until he came in and started centralizing it, the Communist Party kind of ran like a fraternity, a boys' club, and everybody had this understanding that we're not going to go after each other because it could be you tomorrow. Zhang is the only exception to that.
Yeah. So it's really interesting to see that playing out in our timeline. So in this timeline, where we're going to be taking the divergence is, instead of Zhao being removed from power after losing the backing of Deng Xiaoping, Deng instead continues to back him in the wake of the Tiananmen Square protests. And we think there's a very viable path, actually, for Zhao to stay in power post Tiananmen, post 1989. So, Chris or Dylan, do you want to spell out what we talked about?
It was Dylan's idea, so I'm going to let him actually.
I was going to say,
yeah.
Let's have something for Dylan to say. It's been the Chris and Evan show all up until this point.
Yeah. So so I will. We do have an idea for how this is going to work, but I want to kind of back up just a little bit to Zhao Jiang's kind of start. So he is essentially picked by Deng Xiaoping as kind of an up and coming sort of guy. He initially starts out in the province. So his big first early administrative post is in Sichuan, which is, famous in America for Chinese food, but it's in the context of China, it's kind of a rural, remote administrative region. So the effect of this is that Zhao does not come up through the sort of main Beijing urban central party system. He's kind of an outsider from the very beginning. And what ends up happening is, through Deng Xiaoping's sort of control over the party, which even after he's not formally the guy in charge, there's this group of Chinese kind of elder statesmen that it's kind of like Henry Ford from running the Ford company. Even when he appointed CEOs after he retired, you would still go to the house and ask Henry Ford what he thought about. It's kind of that same sort of system to some extent among these Chinese elder statesmen. So Deng Xiaoping, even after he is not the kind of official head honcho of the party, he is still very influential. And Zhao Jiang is one of his two left and right hand men. This is literally what Deng Xiaoping called them. Zhao Jiang is one, and Hu Yaobang is the other. Now, Hu Yaobang is actually the sort of main political leader for kind of the mid-late 80s. It's really Hu Yaobang who's the premier. Premier, general secretary, president, doesn't really matter. He's the leader of communist China. Well, then he dies of a heart attack. That's what actually gets Zhao Jiang into the leader's seat.
The premiership. Yeah.
The premiership. But for the last 10 or 12 years, Deng Xiaoping has basically relied on these two guys as his left and right hand men. So if you are going into Tiananmen in 1989 without knowing everything that happens afterwards, all of your indications would be that Deng Xiaoping is still going to stick with his guy. Like, it tracks with everything that he's been doing. Zhao is basically his handpicked successor after Hu Yaobang dies. So the idea is, instead of Deng Xiaoping kind of approving this sort of, and I hate to say this phrase because it's kind of like Chris, it's almost a paradox. The reactionary side of the Communist Party, who want to do military crackdown and all this stuff. Our thought is that Zhao is going to propose kind of a compromise that sort of builds on some reforms that he and Deng Xiaoping and Hu Yaobang had already started in the 80s. One of the things that this opening of the economy presented, especially as people were able to go to universities and have some upward mobility in the Communist Party, is they were not able to. There was a sense of entrenchment and a sort of corruption among the bureaucracy. So they started to open up some of the very low level, positions in the bureaucracy to, elections, at least is what they were called, even though they may or may not have really been elections, but at least they went through the motions. So our idea is that Zhao is going to propose this as a compromise to these student protesters. Hey, we're gonna open up some of the, even to the provincial administrative level, kind of these lower and middle Communist Party positions to quote unquote elections. So that was really one of the things that the protesters were calling for. So this would have been a very attractive option. It would still fit in with the four principles that Deng Xiaoping put in, with the party and the people's dictatorship being one of the things that constitutionally you cannot disrupt, but you can have elections in the party. And then, me using my lawyer brain for a minute, the tiny little fine print that's going to be on the back of this agreement that's going to help appease the hardliners is and this is really Chris's little fine print idea, so I'm going to give him full credit. Is
yes, Chris's database administrator fine print. I don't understand that, but
you basically, the idea is you have to be a member in good standing of the Communist Party in order to qualify for these elections. Now, who are the people that decide? Chris mentioning Xi Jinping's anti-corruption tactics. Mm-hmm. Who are the people that decide who's a member in good standing? Well, it's all these old people that may or may not necessarily be in official capacities of power, but they've been essentially de facto running the party in various shapes or forms since Mao dies. So there is still, this is the appeasement to the reactionary side of, we're having elections. And the analogy that I used when we were bouncing this idea around is, in the Western world, democratic elections are, think of an ocean of candidates. You've got all your different, especially in Europe, you've got all your different parties, 16 or 17 different parties in France and Germany that all are competing for their basic platforms. In the communist Chinese system that we're sort of envisioning, that ocean is really a puddle. So you have candidates, you may even have 3, 4, or 5 candidates for the people to choose from, but they're all going to be vetted by the Communist Party. Some of them are going to be specifically implanted in the election by the Communist Party. So basically, even though the people have a choice of who they can elect into these administrative positions, the party still has top-down control of the people that they want to try and get in there. It just becomes slightly more meritocratic in popular support, because out of this pool that the Chinese Communist Party finds acceptable for this election, the people are going to choose their candidate. And then the worst case, if the candidate doesn't do well, the party can always have, whoever their favorite horse is run in the next election or go down in a corruption scandal or whatever. And then the process continues. So that's this compromise election solution is what we're proposing gets Zhao to stay in the premiership after Tiananmen Square.
what it does, what promising elections for lower level officials does is it clears the square.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that's really the thing.
And here's the thing as well. Not only does it clear the square, but Zhao was already looking into basically having like provincial people's congresses, and he was also studying the Hong Kong civil service. Like pretty much right when he was overthrown, he was about to implement something very similar to that. So I think there's a lot of precedent even in our own timeline for us to be able to have Zhao become the great compromiser. Basically, he kind of becomes the Henry Clay of China.
That is a comparison I was not expecting to hear on this podcast.
That is not what I was expecting to have happen either, but I just decided to drop it.
But I think it's a fairly good solution, and it also makes sense in the kind of Soviet Chinese dichotomy that we thought about, because the Chinese have been doing essentially glasnost that the Soviets are trying to crash course. The Chinese have been doing a version of that for essentially 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's much less, one, it's much less heavy handed. And two, the agricultural base of China makes much more sense to do it, because worst case, if some of your economic openings up and you're sort of, to ruin an Adam Smith quote, the free red hand of the market, not quite doing exactly what your market management is intended to do.
The not so invisible
you can still,
hands.
Yeah, the not so invisible giant red hand of the market. You can still at least mostly feed people in China by this point. Under Mao, that was a different story. But in the Soviet Union, they can't even do that right, because it's all central planning. Their management of the grain fields is one of the problems.
I mean, I think the important thing to think about is collectivization. When the Chinese tried it during the Great Leap Forward, like I said, Mao got removed.
Yeah.
The Soviets, when Stalin tried it, everybody else got removed.
Yeah.
And the entire Soviet economy never paused on that, never self-corrected, and their heavy industry was developed by Stalin for military purposes. China, because it did not kind of distort its economy, was in a much better position to have economic openness.
Yeah, the rubber, it's not going to be so much as a rubber band stretched tight and the reaction is going to be violent. It's more a waterbed where you're going to kind of push on it here. It's going to blah, 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 and then the reaction's going to be a little bit on the corner, but you can kind of massage it and manage the waves as you kind of go around. Also, a waterbed was not what I was expecting to come up in this episode.
Craziness. I love it. Something that I think is really interesting to think about is at this point, because remember I mentioned earlier about the whole Sino-Soviet split. In our timeline, by the time like Zhao took power, the relationship was kind of starting to thaw again. They were kind of starting to become a little bit more buddy-buddy, due to like ideological, pragmatic similarities between Gorbachev and the Chinese leadership at that point. Gorbachev actually visited China in May of 1989 for the first summit between the two countries in 30 years. So things were already kind of going a certain direction. But I think, and I guess this is going to be like an open question of the differences between, the Soviet collapse, really, because that's what happened. It really wasn't very well managed. The Soviet collapse in, the early 90s, 91, and the differences that we see there of, all of these little, small independent countries who don't even have parliaments, who don't even have a leadership structure. But the one thing they do have? Nuclear weapons. So you have basically all of the old, Communist Party of the Soviet Union, these people who they were probably not very ideologically married to communist principles at all. They were just the people who happened to be in charge when everything fell apart. They're trying to go around and basically claim whatever pieces of the pie that they can for themselves when the Soviet Union is collapsing. All this state-owned stuff is now basically becoming oligarchic-owned stuff, in essence. We have countries who are barely, They're literally, it's like handing a newborn infant an AR-15. Like, they do not have any ability to manage these nuclear weapons that are now in their country. I think China would have been a lot different, because not only would the change have become more gradual over time and more, as Dylan put it, massaged, well managed. But I think, and this is something that we can either delve into now or just push for later. But something I thought about while preparing for this episode was, what would happen to China's own autonomous regions in the midst of these changes? We have Tibet and we have the Uyghurs, right? Who have both been, yearning for more power, more, independence in their own internal affairs for a pretty long time. Just due to various factors. They don't have nukes. They don't have, any of those other kind of, they may be provinces, but they're not like on a Soviet level, socialist republic, in any stretch. I'm just going to throw out there and say, I don't think these gradual changes would lead to anything like, an independent Tibet or an independent Xinjiang or whatever. But I do think it is an interesting question to think of, would there have been a little bit more political autonomy for these regions? And I'm gonna just throw that out there. What do we think about that?
I mean, I think it's certainly something that is going to happen, at least in the short term. Again, because of the sort of crew of politicians that sort of Zhao came up with, because his predecessor, the premier Hu Yabang, that is literally one of the things that he did. He I think is the first premier who actually visited Tibet after it became an autonomous region, and he actually instituted reforms to basically, instead of the Han Chinese, occupying forces forcing the Tibetans to learn Mandarin, he actually instituted some things to reverse that, both in Tibet and in the Uyghur region, where the administrative professionals and the soldiers in those regions had to learn the local language. He was not so much a liberalizer, he was just pragmatic. He's like, look, these people have been speaking these languages and behaving this way for thousands of years. You can't expect them in 20 years to completely change their culture and society. So if we're going to manage these regions and truly incorporate them into, the Chinese Communist Party, we have to meet them halfway, because these people are essentially their own cultures. So we need to incorporate socialism into them instead of stamp socialism on top of them.
So
I can see that.
I think Dylan is talking about the wrong region.
Well, Tibet is the
Tibet's
one that
very
Hugh went to. Yeah,
Tibet's easy.
Uyghurs are a different story, but he did the reforms or something. He tried with both.
You're absolutely right. But I think the Uyghurs are very interesting and very dangerous, because who are the Tibetans outside of Tibet? Who does Tibet look to outside of Tibet? Dalai Lama. But basically, they don't really have like somebody on the other side of the border looking to cause trouble. East Turkestan, Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, 100% do. One of the things that the Chinese government and the Americans are involved in is this little thing called the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which, by the way, actually borders China. And when the Soviet Empire collapses, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, they are all Muslim Turkic nations bordering China that the Uyghurs can look to and say, that is what we want.
Yeah. And I think, so while you were saying that, one of the things that popped into my head is, and I don't know if this is what would happen. I think you're right that the Uyghurs are in a very different position than Tibet. And I actually think the Uyghurs probably would end up receiving more harsh treatment than the Tibetans under no matter what reforms are
Because-
instituted because of this foreign influence. But I wonder
Because
if
you can look at them and say, you are not Chinese, you are foreigners, you are a national security threat.
yes, but so communist China is one of the phrases that you hear is communism with Chinese characteristics. So I almost wonder if at least an attempt to try and be pragmatic with the Uyghurs is a sort of similar thing where it's communism with Islamic characteristics. And I don't know how effective it would be, but just by way of an example, and this is going to irritate some conservative people who are very devout Christians. There are some fairly socialist statements in the Bible if you look at them in a certain way. I have not read the Quran. I imagine there are probably at least some other things that you could point to in it that in a certain spin could be used to sort of promote communist and socialist ideals. Again, I don't know if that tactic would work, but I can certainly see someone who's trying to take a more pragmatic tact with the Uyghurs envisioning something like that.
I would say that as someone who has studied comparative religion, I would say there definitely would be a basis for that. I myself am a Christian myself, and so I know what you're referring to. And we here on the Fork in Time crew don't necessarily like to get into, political debates necessarily, but I think the point that Dylan makes, which is very valid, is that regardless of the validity of it, one could possibly, for a propagandistic purpose,
Mhm.
point to certain areas of
Yeah.
religious texts and say that upholds our party line, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's definitely something that could possibly happen as a tactic, as an attempt. But I think what Chris also says is very relevant as well, is that I think just the nature and the characteristics of the Tibetans, and Buddhism with the Dalai Lama is a much different flavor. It's a much different vibe than, the Uyghurs, and they're literally having nation states that they can look to. Now, I mean, of course, one could argue for Tibet, for example, you have a country like, Bhutan or Nepal, but I think again, it more just speaks to the nature of, both like the religious beliefs and practices, and just, I would say even differences in geography, topography as well. Like Tibet is, much less densely populated, and they're the Himalayas. Literally, they are the Himalayas. Welcome to the Himalayas. That's what they are. But if I remember correctly, and I don't have a topographical map pulled up, but Xinjiang, northwestern China, you have like what the Gobi Desert, and like maybe some farmland, whatever. That whole Turkestan area is basically the steppe, right? This is where all the horses of the Mongolians thundered across and conquered territory, right? So you have a much more densely populated Muslim minority in a territory that it is much easier to organize, to coordinate anything, rebellions, whatever. So I think, Dylan, to your point, I think that there would probably be that similar type of attempt. They would probably go over better in Tibet,
Yeah.
but I don't think it's going to work over as well with the Uyghurs.
So
I think you've been biting at the chomp or chomping at the bit. I always mix it up.
yeah, something's going
Doing
through
that
my
for a while.
mind right now, which is, in our time, in our nowadays, right now, China has what is called the Belt and Road Initiative, which is trying to build relationships with Central Asia.
Mm-hmm.
Because Central Asia is floating on a sea of gas that the Chinese economy cannot get enough of. I think it might be really interesting to think about, how does China handle the collapse of the Soviet Union?
I think that's really interesting.
The United States, George H.W. Bush, and later Bill Clinton, are very clear and make a lot of promises to Russia that we have no interest in gobbling up territory. Now, lo and behold, Poland, Hungary, the Baltics are all NATO members. We don't need to get into that. Um, eh, China makes no such promises. And I think if China isn't dealing with the shock of a Tiananmen turning the way it does, 2 years later is really interested in applying something that the one thing most Americans know about the Chinese, if Americans know anything about the Chinese language, is that the character for like challenge is also the character for opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
They're very interested in Central Asia because now there's nobody there. So I think that's a really interesting.
Well, and yeah, and here's something to think about too. Like Clinton basically ran on a promise of, look, Cold War's over. We're cool. We're chill again. We need to focus on ourselves now, right? We aren't going to spend any more money, fighting in the Cold War in the hot spots. So let's stop spending money fighting the Russians anymore. The thing is that we have a difference, for example, with how, the United States treated, with the Marshall Plan in Germany, like after World War II, in the post-war years, and in Japan as well, versus how they treated the Soviets and the Russians, the post-Soviet republics. I pulled up a comparison here. It was about $300 billion that we spent in West Germany and, Western Europe, and $350 billion in Japan. And both of those countries had economic miracles that were sparked, a few years later down the road. By comparison, after the Soviet Union collapsed, we spent a tenth of that, about 65 billion. And that was basically just purely humanitarian relief. So essentially, our attitude as Americans were like, all right, you were the big bad guys. You were the stars of all of those, terrible 80s movies, all throughout this time, you were the bad guys. And now we don't have to fight you anymore. But that doesn't mean we're going to give you a handout. That doesn't mean we're going to help you up. You're kind of on your own at this point. You got to figure out this democracy stuff on your own because we're, like Forrest Gump. I think I'm a little tired. We don't want to do this anymore. So I think, and I mentioned this pre-podcast, the collapse of the Soviet Union is humongous propaganda for the Chinese Communist Party today. They're like, hey, look what happened to the Soviets after they liberalized. Do you want the same thing to happen to us? So I think a more liberalized China, I won't say, again, with our system, I think the biggest comparison I can make for this in modern terms is Singapore. Like Singapore is kind of this interesting, you have some elections, but the central government is very, very, very strong. It's almost like a neo-authoritarianism. Like you literally can't leave a wad of gum on the city sidewalk or else you'll get caned. I don't think it's that severe, but like there are some pretty, severe punishments in Singapore. The central government's very strong there, but there are democratic elements to it. So I think that's probably the best comparison I can make to how China would probably look and function in the 90s. So when you have that sort of China with, more of an emphasis on the economic reforms, but you also have like, Dylan's great political reforms that kind of meet halfway to make the protesters and the hardliners happy. In our timeline, we have a conservative hardline China responding and reacting to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In this timeline, I think, Chris, I think what you brought up, a Belt and Road Initiative that we nowadays see in our modern context of an authoritarian China trying to extend out influence. You also have China doing all these massive infrastructure projects in Africa. and all of these infrastructure projects and security deals in the Pacific, right? And that greatly worries us. That greatly worries Australia, right? On a geopolitical level, I think China would want to make sure that the Soviets. I think there'd be two reactions. First of all, I think there would be another propagandistic opportunity for China to still point to them and say, "Hey, they tried to pursue both at once. They messed up." But that helps reinforce and strengthen China's version of liberalization instead of their authoritarianism. Secondly, I think they would be more open to, because, and Chris, as you mentioned before, like with the Uyghurs and having Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, etc., all on, that Western area, they would also probably be spooked a little bit by the possibility of the free flow of nuclear weapons in these new states. So, you know, I did speech and debate in high school, and so this is why I like this podcast so much, because I'm able to squeeze 5 words into 10 words. But I think what
You should try law school.
Yeah, maybe I should. I think what I'm coming to here is, I think in a post-Soviet world with a more liberal China, I think China would have probably stepped in a lot more to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think that is a fascinating idea to think about the possibilities of what would a more a more Chinese influenced Russia, more liberal Russia look like.
Why? Let's ask, why did the United States spend, rough math from what you said, $600 billion, 600 million?
$650 billion between Japan and Germany, right?
Why did they spend that much money on people we just got done blowing up?
Well, it's because they wanted to provide bulwarks against
the Russians.
Soviet. Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
They were scared of the Russians.
Yeah.
Who were we scared of the Russians being influenced by in 1993?
Nobody.
Yeah.
Jinx, you owe me a soda.
But
yes,
I think
exactly in this scenario.
Scenario.
Well, and so this kind of gets to.
We have a great game situation developing in Central Asia.
That's what I think, because fun fact, the last country in the Soviet Union for like 2 weeks at the very end was, I forget if it was Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan, but the Soviet Union was literally one country for like 2 weeks. So, and in the mid 90s and early 90s, China has not, I like the idea of a Belt and Road Initiative, but China is still not quite,
maybe they're not
to the economic level that I think they can do that kind of thing. But what I'm envisioning is this is, so this is a China that has more quote unquote liberal, quote unquote democracy. But it also has a reactionary component that we've already talked about. All these guys who in our timeline axed Zhao after Tiananmen, they're still around. They're still a concern. Their view, I think, is going to be more concerned about the future of communism. So what I'm kind of envisioning, I like this, what we've kind of hinted at, it seems, of a sort of Chinese kind of attempt at rapprochement or outreach to some of these, especially in Central Asia.
Central Asia.
Former Soviet countries.
We got at least 3 or 4 more episodes of this arc before they're in Central Europe.
Yeah, right. But I think,
I'm trying to keep this to 1. We have plenty of arcs.
Exactly.
I love it, but I think we do have a good ending off point.
Yeah,
we can honestly expand any episode that we're on into a whole arc, and that's fun. But
what I think this really sets up at, and I'm going to kind of leave this sort of like kind of in the mid 90s as this is sort of setting up. This is kind of a, I imagine the Chinese, at least thinking about, the Chinese have always been kind of isolationist for the last couple hundred years. So I don't know that they would try and create a new sort of Soviet Union kind of thing. But I can at least see them reaching out to the former Soviet Central Asian countries, if not necessarily Russia. One, as a sort of, hey, we're still here, we're still functioning. If we would be happy to start doing trade deals, advisors, things like that to strengthen political ties.
And build pipelines and give us your resources.
And that becomes the start of that, which becomes kind of what we understand now as the Belt and Road Initiative. But I think it honestly would start more as a kind of internationalist governmental administrative dialogue before you start doing the economic incentives, just because of the position China's kind of at in the early 90s.
I'm kind of interested in the idea of using Central Asia in the United States in the 19th century. There was kind of this sense of we can keep expanding to keep the domestic demons
problems
at bay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we can use Turkestan as we used Texas at one point, so that these conservatives who are married to kind of a Maoist political system can go out to the middle of the desert while the reformers stay in Shanghai and on the coast and build a liberal economic system there.
That's kind of exactly where I was going. Yep.
That's actually really interesting because, what you're going to have by the end of this, and we didn't even really talk about this at all during the episode, and this would be just really interesting to think about too, is we would have essentially the more hardliners, as we say, put in the desert. We have the, kind of more liberal China. That's really the main, central, Politburo running the show. This whole time, we've had a little island off the coast known as Taiwan, which has become a full-fledged liberal democracy under, the old, like Chiang Kai-shek, once they fled in 1949.
Not yet.
No, yeah, I think until it was in the 90s that they
was it in the 90s
No,
that they
it was 2000 before the
was it 2000 before they got rid of the dictatorship?
Before the
interesting.
it was one of those really interesting. Taiwan was literally the exact situation you guys were kind of playing with, which is the dictatorship, the military dictatorship ended in the 70s and 80s, but the KMT kept winning the elections right up until 2000. And in 2000 was the first time there was a non-KMT president that had actually won.
There was at least an intra-party transfer of power.
The economic, the political system had kind of transitioned away from a democracy, but it was still a one-party state.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
But
I actually didn't know that.
In this world, that actually could, based on the other stuff we've been talking about, that could also provide grounds for kind of a rapprochement, not nearly to the same level, I don't think, given the animosities, but at least a dialogue with Taiwan.
I was going to say, I think if you have a more similar system going on in the mainland, I think there would be a little bit more not open hostilities, but maybe a little bit of trying to extend an olive branch or, trying to get something to
a thawing, if you will.
A thawing. Like, I don't know if it would necessarily lead, at least right away where we're going to be ending this off. Almost certainly not would it lead to a reintegration of Taiwan. But I could see it, moving forward into the 21st century. That could possibly end up happening. I don't know. And also, we didn't even really touch on the transfer of Hong Kong either. So, but I think there are some things that ultimately we'll probably just have to let pile around in the minds of our listeners, maybe for another day.
You know what? Yeah, let's throw it at you guys. Do you like where we're going with this? Should this be an arc?
Yeah, I think we can certainly leave it here and leave some dangling threads. But if y'all, like this episode, if you think this is a fork that you want to explore more, leave a comment in the Discord, throw some ideas. Maybe we can just turn it into a Discord discussion. And if there's enough meat, we can revisit it. This one's got options either way, I think.
Yeah. I like that. I think that sounds like a good idea because I greatly enjoyed this discussion, and it is such a, obviously a huge country, literally the most populous country on the planet, and something that we don't necessarily touch as much on A Fork in Time. And we were able to come up with some really interesting ideas off of it.
Yeah.
So, last comment I'm going to say before I start drawing things to a close, and if you guys have anything else, feel free. But in the interview that, or in the article that I read that, inspired this episode, which we can probably put this in the show notes. I do think it's paywalled on Foreign Policy Magazine, but if someone is still interested enough to, try and seek it out, or you happen to have a foreign policy subscription, feel free to read it, because this is what inspired me to come up with this topic. There's a really interesting quote about Zhao Ziyang. I forget who it was. I think it was like the interviewer for him on NBC News. He basically said, after I spoke with Zhao, I thought this guy could run for the mayor of Chicago. Like he just seemed like a very like easygoing, kind of guy that you could just talk to and really learn a lot of information from.
See, I thought you were about to say he was going to be brought up on corruption charges by Xi Jinping.
Well, possibly that too. That could have happened as well. That could have been the end of his political arc. But as long as Chicago is being mentioned, I'm just going to say, hey, if this guy could become the mayor of Chicago, maybe in some alternate timeline, he could have become the next pope. Because at the time of recording, we have the first American pope that just got elected from Chicago. So who knows? But on that rather interesting, very random note, gentlemen, do you have any other last minute thoughts or things before we close out?
No, I think I've just about given away all my dumb ideas for the day.
All right. Well, thank you guys again so much for tuning in and spending some of your precious listening hour real estate with us. If you enjoyed the show, feel free to check out our other episodes. Join us on the Discord community, where we have a small but very dedicated and active group of individuals who love to, throw around these interesting historical what ifs. And as always, if you see a fork in time, what do you think we should do with it?
Take it.
Take it. All right, guys. See y'all next time.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.